Hey, you guys, welcome to another episode of True Set Free Question and Answer here live at Calvary Chapel Tri-Cities in Kennewick, Washington. It's July 7th, 2021. We are here blessed to answer your Bible questions. This is Pastor Steve Whinery. He's a senior pastor here. My name is Matt Lewis. If you have questions, email behind me, crosswalkradio@gmail.com. 707-872-7677 is a number you can leave a voicemail on. You can text. Either or. I've been getting a lot of questions lately, so during the week, if you have stuff, email is the best way to jump in that line. Of course, if you're watching us live on the social media, YouTube and Facebook, post on there. Do our best to get to you. If you need Pastor Steve to pray for you, post that on there as well, and we'd love to do that. For announcements, I have just a few. Get on our website or download our app. On our app has our bulletin with all of our events going on. There's a lot of stuff happening around here these days. Pastor Steve, last week, if you don't know, we have a Wednesday and a Sunday evening 6:30 service along with our normal Sunday morning. But he started the book of John last week, so you're fresh into it. If you guys coming tonight, Pastor Steve's in the book of John for our 6:30 service. I also have 8611, which is our high school group. They're doing a big outreach July 7th through the 9th. If you're familiar with this, I think this is either the second or third annual one we've done. It's a big event they do out in our amphitheater. Encourage you, if you have high school kids or if you're a high schooler watching this, invite your friends, come on out. They'd love to have you. It's going to be a great time. That's all I really have, unless you have something you want to share with them.
Nope.
Good to go. Let's jump into some questions here. My first one for you, Pastor Steve, says on the topic of evolution. He says a lot here. I don't have enough room for it. I'll just go ahead and read what he said. Well, I don't have a name, so I don't know if it's a guy or girl. They say, I have heard many pastors speak about the various flaws that go with evolutionist theories of an old Earth and even older universe. I've heard mention the problems with the magnetic field being too strong or the sun being too big. I've heard about problems with carbon dating or geological structures that do not support an old Earth that is millions, yet billions of years old. I've heard pastors talk about the gaps in DNA evolution and the lack of evidence for macroevolution. He's given you a lot to deal with on this one. Mm-hmm. The problem is I'm no expert on these, nor could I begin to become an expert. There are what seem to be reputable articles that refute these claims made primarily by creationists. I want to start trying to become an expert on at least one or two of these areas to better defend creationism. Could you steer me in the right direction as to what might be the two areas that I could begin to research myself, read the academic studies, and eventually be able to defend with well-supported and objective knowledge? And then he goes on. This actually is a good question because, you know, when you get saved, the first area you have to go is who created the world.
Right.
So you're a science guy. Uh-huh. When we go through Genesis, you talk about all this stuff. When you're brand new, where do you start? Like what, because there's so much, and maybe you're not, mind isn't a science guy. Where do you begin?
Yeah, I just began with basics. With me, the issue that settled it for me as far as evolution goes was the issue of the age of the Earth specifically. And I was in a chemistry class, and the teacher basically put up the symbol, or the chemical symbol for uranium, and then the symbol for lead, and talked about how radioactive uranium over 4.5 billion years, half of it will turn to lead, and we found rocks that are half lead and half uranium. And so the Earth has to be 4.5 billion years old. And so that was one of the things that I looked at, and I thought that was irrefutable. And you know, I'm a high school kid at the time, and it wasn't until after I became a Christian, I walked into a bookstore at my church and picked up a book on the Genesis. Actually, it was called the Genesis Flood, and they had a chapter on radiometric dating. And so I just went to the chapter, started reading it while I was in the bookstore. And he talked about 3 basic assumptions. You don't know if anything's touched that rock for 4.5 billion years, taken away any of the uranium, which can be taken away, or taken away the lead. And that's called a closed system. and you don't know for sure what the process rate is or if it's been changed, and you don't know how it started. It's like walking into a room with a candle that's been half burned. Well, you don't know how long the candle's been there. You have no idea. You have to have a starting point. It could have been lit 3 seconds ago, or it could have been lit, an hour and a half ago. You have no idea unless you have the starting point, and that was one of the points that they made. And at that point, I realized that I had not been thinking rationally in the sense of I didn't know how to think about those things, and that there were actual answers to this kind of stuff.
So on that note, for the starting points, they just make them up?
No, what they well, yeah, basically they just make them up. So, we've known about radioactivity since the early 1900s. And so they've measured the half-life for a certain period of time, and they extrapolate majorly. Obviously, you're only talking about over just a little over 100 years for even the knowledge of radioactivity, much less uranium.
Right.
And so you're going through and you're measuring the half-life of something for less than 100 years, and you're extrapolating it out over 4.5 billion years. There's some wiggle room there.
Yeah.
In the first place.
I'm a simpleton. I love your candle analogy. A candle burning, I might be able to measure the wax that's dripped down or some burning of the wick and try and get close. You will never know if that was a foot or 2 foot or 10 foot because it's gone.
Right.
You have no starting point.
Yeah. Well, with a candle, you don't. With a rock, you have what's left over, as long as it hasn't been touched for 4.5 billion years. So you have the material there, and
Okay.
so the analogy is a little bit different.
Yeah.
You have to assume a candle that call it, I don't know how tall candles are, a foot tall candle, but you don't know if it started out as a foot tall candle. You have no idea. You know what I mean? And so you have some situations there, and it is a good analogy. And so when I figured that out, I realized that there were some problems with it, and then. I start reading up on this stuff, and I find out that the process rate is something that can be changed. It can, obviously radioactivity can be changed with more radioactivity. And so if you have a radioactive event anywhere near something that is, throwing off ions over a period of time, it's going to speed the process up. That's like, with the candle analogy. Saying that candle has been burning at exactly the same rate the whole time that it's been burning. Well, I don't know if somebody turned a fan on or not, and then turned it off. I have no idea.
Right.
And if you turn the fan on, you get more oxygen, it burns quicker.
Yeah.
And so you have the same thing with radioactivity, and that's something that's been known for a few decades now. And so there's a number of assumptions that you have there. Here's another assumption: there is no rock on this planet that's 4.5 billion years old, because the rock that they were using for that information was a meteorite.
I know that. I don't even know how that's possible.
There's assumption upon assumption.
Yeah.
So they're assuming that the meteorite was part of the original creation of the solar system, and they're assuming the whole gas cloud theory. There's just a bunch of assumptions there.
So I'm
we don't
assuming
know where their meteorite came from.
Well, I'm assuming they picked a meteorite because it gives them longer dates than a normal rock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because there's no rock on this planet that
Right.
dates the planet that old.
Yeah. No bias there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And so again, you have that. When I found that out, that was much later.
Yeah.
That I found that out, and so that is one of those areas that I have kind of boned up on, so that when I'm talking with somebody, it takes away that excuse, that whole thing with a long age. I have no idea from radiometric dating how old the planet is. I have no idea, because the numbers are all skewed. And when you look at radiometric dates of historic formations, they don't match. And so what they're doing basically is dating lava rocks. And so the assumption is that when you have a rock and it turns molten, that you basically reset the date for the radioactive isotopes. And so the way this works is uranium over 4.5 billion years or so turns into lead, and what it's doing is it's throwing off particles from the nucleus. And so when you have a lava rock, what they're assuming is, and actually they're not using uranium and lead. I shouldn't have used that example. Potassium argon is the one that they're usually using with lava rocks. And so potassium is an element, argon is also an element, but it's a gas. And so the assumption there is when the rock melts, that the gas is going to be dispersed, and when the rock solidifies, any radiogenic argon, the argon that comes from the decay, is going to be something that was there from the very start. And so that's why you go around and you date historic formations. And the problem with that is, one of my favorite examples of this is Mount St. Helens. We know when Mount St. Helens blew up. It was 1980, and it's got a lava dome. And we know when the lava dome that actually got tested by some creationists was formed. It was 1984, and so the rock the rock that they tested was only from 1984, and they got dates that were anywhere from 250,000 years to 2.2 million years. And obviously that is way off. And this is what happens whenever they date known formations, because the radiometric dating methods, the things that they use, obviously aren't working for historic formations. And so people will say things like, well, it doesn't work for rocks of young age. Well, how do I know a rock is old unless I'm dating it? What if all the rocks are young? And so the dating method is off, is the point that I'm making. And so that is something to look into. And so there's a number of books that you could look at on this. Just a basic creationist book. We'll go through and talk to you about radiometric dating. There is a whole volume that was done not too long ago, back actually in the 2010s, by the what's called the RATE group, RATE, with ICR, and they go through and talk about radiometric dating, whether you're talking about potassium, argon, the different methods, and then radiometric carbon 14 dating, and that kind of stuff. And so that's a little technical. But you can get some basic books on that. So I would chase that one down, because that is a big problem with a lot of people. Another one that I really enjoy, another subject that I really enjoy, is the whole issue of soft tissue in fossils. And so you have these fossils, and it started out with a Tyrannosaurus rex fossil, and a microbiologist named Mary Schweitzer, who had kind of crossed over disciplines. She was working in the Hells Creek Formation up in Montana, and found a T-Rex bone, and it was too big to transport, so they cut it in half. Well, when they cut it in half, they found out the inside wasn't fossilized. That's a problem in the first place. So you got a 67 million year old bone that's not fossilized. That shouldn't be happening. And that's one of the things that I didn't know from my education, whether it was high school or college. I didn't know that you had non-fossilized dinosaur bones. And she found out that some of the tissue was pliable. She went and checked it out, and she found veins, and she found red blood cells, and they are verifiably veins and red blood cells. And she's done this over and over. Now they're finding all this soft tissue from all kinds of dinosaurs. They've gone back into museums and checked out the dinosaur bones, and they found skin, they found collagen, they found proteins, they found DNA. And all this stuff is supposed to be, some of these animals are upward to 300 million years old, and you have these organics that are supposed to have lasted for 300 million years. It's just nonsense. So I would chase that down and just have a list and have people try to explain it. And
why did it take so long for the Mary Schweitzer to find this? These guys that are digging these bones up never saw this before then? I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Specifically, the Hell Creek formation, this is another thing that I found out after the fact. When they dig these bones up, they stink. They smell like death. And so that lets you know that there's organics rotting at that point. That's the only way that this happens. And so I kill an animal, I leave it out on the ground for a year, I come back a year later, it doesn't stink.
Right.
Because everything that can rot has rotted away. And the fact that they're opening up these formations and bringing out these fossils, and they still stink, should be a clue. And the reason that they don't follow up on it is because they have a paradigm. And the paradigm is that a dinosaur died 65 million years ago or more. And so the stink can't be from rot. And then, and obviously, if you believe that these animals died 65 million years ago or more, you're not going to be looking for unfossilized bone. You're not going to be looking for soft tissue. And so the reason that Mary Schweitzer did it was because she is a microbiologist, and the smell that she smelled was, she said, similar to cadavers that she had worked on when she was in grad school. And so, she just went there.
Yeah.
And so, kudos for her, because she actually acted like a scientist
Right.
in the situation. And so I would be chasing that down. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I was doing a men's retreat, and I was just talking about the issue of evolution. And one of the titles for one of my studies was if evolution is true, then why do dinosaur bones stink? And so that's one that I would chase down. Another thing, and if you want to look up some articles that will help you out and kind of get you on the path to what you want to be looking at, I would be going to answersingenesis.org or ICR.org. And they're two good creationist websites, and they've got papers that are good for the layman, and then they've got papers that are much more technical, and so really good stuff. Whenever I'm looking at some of the anti-creation sites, I read some of those papers too. I'm always looking for obfuscation. And so they try to come up with reasons that proteins can last 67 million years or 100 million years, or now up to 300 million years. And they try to look for these things, and they're just patent nonsense. So one of them is that maybe iron causes proteins to not rot over 67 million years. And, okay, give them the point. That's why, when they go through and they're going to embalm a body, we don't use formaldehyde anymore. Now we use iron, right?
No.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
Because iron doesn't make iron will not work. Formaldehyde works, and that only works for a while. Iron is not good for this. And so, it's just obfuscation, and it's just excuse making. When Mary Schweitzer came up with her results, the whole scientific community that dealt with dinosaur bones was in an uproar, telling her that she that she didn't do the science right, that she basically allowed the samples to become polluted and that kind of stuff. And she, to her credit, did her science carefully.
Yeah.
And she made sure that she had her ducks in a row, and they couldn't say anything about it. And so now they come up with all kinds of nonsense excuses.
Right.
And this is stuff you can see. It's like you're looking at red blood cells. They have pictures of red blood cells, and then they try to make it something like biological. I don't know. Different types of small-celled animals and that kind of stuff to try to make an excuse. And now it's to the point where they don't have any excuses. So the whole thing with soft-tissued tissues in fossils is a great place to go to get a handle on this stuff, because you start sharing that with people who are into evolution. A lot of them don't know about this. And it's one of those things that's just in your face, and it's hard to get away from. The other thing that you might want to look at, so I'm giving you three. So radiometric dating, soft tissue in dinosaur fossils. And then the third one would be, if you're gonna talk about the age of the universe and that kind of stuff, you might want to get into some stuff that has to do with starlight and time and that kind of stuff. There is a guy who is doing a really good job. He's an astrophysicist, and his name is Lyle. I believe it's Jason Lyle, and he has a book called Taking Back Astronomy. And I just looked it up, and you can get that on Amazon. And actually, he's got a number of books on Amazon. And he's got a good take on the whole cosmological problem, because that's another one that people are going to bring up. They're going to bring up the age of the Earth. They're going to bring up the age of the universe, and how do you answer those things from a biblical perspective? And so dinosaurs, age of the Earth, age of the universe. Once you get that stuff down, there's some other places to go, but you get that stuff down, and a lot of people who are reasonable are going to be convinced at this point that it's at the very least something to look into. And so I would do that.
So is the short answer that you really have to do your homework, that there's no learn these two facts and you're good to go? You really need to spend some time studying this to know what you're talking about, to be able to have a basis?
Well, just it doesn't have to take a lot, When the Mary Schweitzer stuff came out, I was picking that up in scientific articles, like in magazines.
Yeah.
And I was picking that stuff up, and then I chased it down and got some more facts, so I knew exactly what was going on at the time. And you pass that out to an evolutionist in the sense that you're in a conversation. You say, "What about this?" You say dinosaurs are 67 million years old. What about this? And you can get lists on the internet of soft tissues that have been found in dinosaur bones. Like I said, they have skin now because now they've been looking for it. And they have lists of these things and what they're dated as far as evolutionary theory goes, and it's just nonsense. And you hand a list like that to somebody, or you just go through a list, like you put it on your phone, go through a list like that with somebody, and they'll be sitting there with their mouth open, not knowing what to say.
Right.
And it will at least get the point across that maybe you ought to look into this a little bit more. Takes the fog away.
Yeah, the time that we live in now, isn't there such an overwhelming, enormous amount of evidence to the other side that, where when evolution first, the whole Darwinism thing first came out, it was tipping the scales because we were playing catch up, not knowing. Isn't it now overwhelmingly the other way? Because when you're talking about the age of the Earth, and I'm not a science guy, but when I went through that, there's a book called In 6 Days. In the age of the Earth, it wasn't just radio cover dating. They talked about red star shifts, Mississippi River Delta, the dust on the moon, and then you bring up dinosaur bones. Like, there's this overwhelming amount of evidence just for the age of the Earth.
Right.
That's one category. You immediately step into another one, like, the whole Big Bang, where first there was nothing and then it exploded, that something can be created out of nothing. You get into DNA, where you're talking about a genetic code, and you can go on and on and on down this trail of evidence that just spending a few weeks diving through this, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it is. We live in awesome times, and for example, if you just the whole issue of DNA, the fact that it's a code,
right?
So it's like literally a digital code. So the difference between digital and analog is when you have a clock and you have hands, and wherever the hands are pointing, that determines what time it is. That's called analog. Digital is you have numbers that mean things, numbers and colons and that kind of stuff, and they mean things. It's a code, and so when you're looking at DNA, it's coded, and that means there is a language, and there's literally letters and words in the language and paragraphs in the language. These correspond to genes and and chromosomes and that kind of stuff. And if that had been known at the time of Darwin, in fact, if Mendel's work on genetics, he was a guy in the 1800s, and his work didn't get popularized until after Darwin. If Mendel's work had been popularized before Darwin, Darwinism would never have gotten a toehold.
Right.
And if DNA information had been there, Darwinism would never have gotten a toehold. There's no way that you can do the things that evolution states that you can do with the information we have about the genetic code of pretty much everything.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was specifically because his whole premise was on a simple cell theory.
Yeah.
And we know that that's this complex factory in just that little tiny cell.
A cell is like a city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On top of the intelligent code designer, like writer of a book that's making it all run.
Right. Yeah. And so there's a number of things that you can look at when you're dealing with the whole evolution thing. It take from my point of view, it takes more faith. It would take more faith for me to believe in evolution than to believe in creation.
For sure.
Because it's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
The whole issue. You can't even get past chemical evolution, and it's just basic chemistry. You can't get past it, and it's the reason that everybody has stopped talking about life coming from the oceans. Having a primordial soup in the oceans. Nobody talks about that anymore. And it's because chemical evolution will not work on the Earth. That's why they're talking about the Earth being seeded from, comets or asteroids hitting the Earth and that kind of stuff, because we can't figure out how it started here. And then on top of it, you can't get past the beginning. And once you have that, then you got problems with the whole rest of the thing, because what you're doing is you're adding information to a code, and it's all got to work. It's like adding information to a book. The book's you got to be able to read the book, and if you're going to add information to it, it has to be coherent, and it has to work with the rest of the book, with every chapter of the book, is the idea. And so it's radically complex. And this is stuff that I like, but you can get a good working understanding of a lot of this stuff with some of the simpler books and some of the articles.
Do you know
lots of information out there?
Yeah, for sure. Do you know, are they still teaching this in the public school system, starting in high school and then going to college? Are they still on this old school Darwinian evolution, or because of the evidence, are they moving away?
I haven't gone back through and looked at that lately, but the last I checked, probably about 5 years ago, they're still using the whole recapitulation in the womb thing.
With the pictures?
Yeah, with the pictures.
So if you just had a
and that was a hoax. Like literally, they don't use pictures. We got plenty of pictures of fetuses.
Yeah.
In every stage of development. When you see these in your textbook, and it's the whole idea that you go through through a fish stage. Your embryo goes through a fish stage, and then it goes through a reptilian stage or amphibian stage, then a reptilian stage, and and that kind of thing all the way up. And it's a recapitulation of evolution. They don't use pictures when they're doing that. They use the original drawings.
Right.
That the guys drew back in I believe it was the 1800s of all things. They use the original drawings because the pictures don't match what they want to portray.
Yeah.
In themselves. So, just that is
so
crazy.
If you had if you had a baseline fundamental understanding, just a simpleton understanding, and you walk into a high school class and they're teaching that, they're gonna be either blown away or ticked off because it's not even close anymore.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming.
I believe that if I'd have known something about the assumptions that were being made with radiometric dating, with their 4.5 billion years and uranium to lead and all that stuff, I think my chemistry teacher was pretty reasonable. I could have, if I'd have known this stuff, well, how did we know that the rock started out all uranium? And she would have gone, oh, well, I don't know, because she was that kind of lady.
Yeah.
And how do we know that the process rate's the same? Back then, she probably would have argued that. And how do we know that none of the uranium has been taken away? Because you can leach uranium away with a weak acid. So you take the uranium away, the rock automatically looks older. And so how do we know that that hasn't happened? And she probably would have gone, she probably would have gave me an A for she liked me too. So, but yeah.
You think that would happen nowadays?
Depends on, I don't know, depends on the teacher. There's
Yeah.
With the information that's out there, teachers don't have an excuse for not knowing this stuff.
Yeah.
And not presenting both sides of the issue. And that's how science is supposed to work. You present both sides of the issue, and
for sure,
and you come to a conclusion. You don't sit there and skew the information. Not a good thing.
All right. Well, if that doesn't give you a start in the right direction, I don't know how to help you, because that's a pretty good answer.
That's a long answer.
Yeah.
Program's half over now.
It's a science question. You should have known better. This is Pastor Steve. All right. Ecclesiastes 12:7. They quote, "Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." From reading this verse, a friend concluded that everyone's spirit returns to God whether they're a believer or an unbeliever. She said that the unbeliever in hell can never communicate with God because of not having a spirit. She asserts that the spirit can be divided from the soul based on Hebrews 4:12. And then they quote, "Two-edged sword piercing even to the division of soul and spirit." Is this what the Bible teaches, and what verse can explain about an unbeliever's spirit after death as opposed to a believer's spirit?
Well, the classic passage on what happens to you after death comes from Jesus. And so Jesus in the book of Luke in chapter 16 is talking about the parable, or the story of the rich man and Lazarus. I don't like to call it a parable because Jesus never gave names in parables. Yeah. So I believe it actually happened. And so you have Lazarus, who's a believer, and he ends up in a place of comfort. And you have a rich man who's an unbeliever, and he ends up in torment in Hades. And so that's the ultimate end of believers and unbelievers. As far as Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the spirit returning to God who gave it, that's exactly what happens with everyone. The spirit returns to God who gave it. When you look in the book of Revelation, the Bible talks about the fact that at the last judgment, everybody's going to be standing before the throne of God. Now, there's a judgment for Christians, and that's called the Bema Seat judgment, and that's a judgment for rewards. But in verse 11 of chapter 20 of Revelation, it says, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away." That's God. "And there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God. And books were open. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works." Then death and Hades, it's talking about everybody at that point who was dead, and everybody at that point who was in Hades, in the grave, were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, and anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And so you have everybody standing before God, and then the ones who stand before him and don't have a relationship with him, the ones who are not found written in the book of life, he takes them and he does what he wants with them. And what he does with them is he casts them into the lake of fire. And so both things happen. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the spirit returns to God who gave it, and then God does what he wants with the spirit. And in this case, what he does is he casts them into the lake of fire. I don't know. I don't believe that there's a separation of the spirit and the soul at the last judgment. That's not what's indicated there. We're told what's going on, and so these people are standing before the Lord. In fact, Jesus talked about the fact that that there was going to be a resurrection of the unrighteous. So not only are they standing before God in a spiritual state, they're standing before God in a physical state, in the sense that they have a resurrection body just like Jesus did. Jesus talked about this in Revelation, or in John chapter 5. He was talking to the Jews, and he said, "You believe that you're going to be raised from the dead. I'm going to be the one who raises you from the dead." And he talked about the resurrection of the just and the resurrection of the unjust, or the resurrection of the righteous and the resurrection of the unrighteous. And so there's a resurrection. And so their spirit and their soul are put back into a body that's a resurrection body, looks like just like the ones we have. And then in that resurrection body, they appear before God. And then God takes the guy and he casts him into the lake of fire. Body, soul, and spirit is what takes place there, is what it looks like. And again, you have a narrative there that tells you exactly what's going on. And so, yeah, no, I wouldn't say that the soul is being separated from the spirit in the passage. So.
All right.
Yeah.
Next one. Out of all the countries that are in protest over the treatment of Palestinians, how many have offered asylum? And that might be a statement and a question at the same time.
It depends on what you're talking about, because there are states that have refugee camps. And so Jordan has one, and Lebanon has one. I believe Syria has one. I believe, but I don't know if it's still there because of the Syrian civil war.
Sorry, I forgot to add the second part. How much international funding / welfare goes to Palestine? So it was a two-part question.
Oh yeah, okay. And so there are nations that have this. There is. I looked this up because I saw this last week and I didn't know the answer to it. And so I just went to a Wikipedia article. And so in 2019, let's see, January to December of 2019, according to the UN's calendar year reporting system, Germany contributed the most of any country in the world, giving $138 million to UNRWA, and that goes to Palestinian refugees, $167 million donation in 2018, followed by the United Kingdom with $76 million, and Saudi Arabia's contribution fell from $115 million in 2018 to $74 million in 2019. United States officially gave zero, and that's because President Trump was in power. The United States in 2014 gave $398 million. Almost $399 million. 2015, $390.5 million. Almost $360 million in 2016. 2017, $359 million, and 18, $65 million, 19, 0, 20, 0, and this year the United States has given $225 million so far, and that's specifically to Palestinian causes. And so they get a lot of money, And unfortunately, what the Palestinians in Gaza specifically do with money is they buy weapons with it. So
it was less than ironic or coincidence that as soon as the Biden administration kicked off the funding again, the rockets started launching.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
PLO
I think that was planned as soon as the election was decided. Yeah, so.
All right, there you go. Next question. Can women lead over men in politics or business in the context of 1 Timothy chapter 2? And what positions of authority, if any, can they hold in the church?
Women need to be silent and be in the kitchen constantly. I'm just joking.
It's for people that know you're... Someone just drove off the road.
Yeah.
What did he just say?
1 Timothy chapter 2 is about church, and that's all it's about. And so you have examples in the Old Testament of women judges, for example. And a judge is different than a pastor, obviously. A judge was a ruler over basically a tribal area in Israel. And so Deborah in the Old Testament was a judge. And so you hear about Barak and Deborah. And when Barak was told to go to war against the Syrians, he didn't want to go by himself. And Deborah specifically, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Deborah basically told him, you're giving the glory to a woman here. And so she knew her culture and she knew what was going on. And she said, yeah, I'll go with you, but you're giving the glory to a woman. And so even then, she was sensitive to the cultural situation. But God put her in charge. You have examples in the New Testament of people who are discipling, and so oh gosh, I'm blanking out on. Oh, brother. Let me look up in Romans. Their names are written. Do you guys not know the names of these guys?
Phoebe?
Yeah. No, Phoebe was a Priscilla and Aquila. Thank you. Phoebe was a deacon, a deaconess. And so you have them, a deaconess in the Bible. Well, let me give you a passage. And so in, let's see, First Corinthians 16, Romans chapter 16, verse 1, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea. Servant in that passage is doulos. Doulos is the word for a deacon. It's the term that was used. Deacon is a term that means servant. And it looks like it was a title there. And then later on it talks about Priscilla and Aquila and the fact that they were fellow workers in Christ Jesus. Well, Priscilla and Aquila were instrumental in discipling people, specifically in Corinth. And so they're obviously doing things together in that situation. Neither one of them is a pastor of a church. And First Timothy chapter 2 is not talking about the fact that women can't do anything in church. It's specifically talking about the fact that they shouldn't be the teaching elder in a church. And so in my church, I have women doing all kinds of stuff. In fact, the women do lots of stuff. In my church, our principal, well, we have two principals of our school now. We have a principal of our junior high and high school, and then we have a principal of the grade school, and they're both women. And so the passage in 1 Timothy chapter 2 doesn't have to do with teaching in a school. And so obviously women can be teachers, and you talked about politics. I already addressed that with Deborah. I believe that women can be in politics. And so I don't judge who I'm voting for by their gender. Well, I do now, because they can't try to keep changing the definition of what a gender is. But I don't judge politicians by their gender, the normative gender. I judge them by their actions. And so one of my favorite politicians was actually the Prime Minister of England back in the 80s, and she was a woman. And so I just liked that lady. And so, again, when the Bible's talking about issues like that, where it's putting a role on a man and a woman, it's talking about in the context of the thing that's being spoken of. And so 1 Timothy chapter 2 is talking about the context of church leadership and specifically teaching elders. It goes right into it in chapter 3. And Ephesians chapter 5 talks about a subsidiary role for women in marriage. And so the husband is to be like Christ and the wife is to be like the church. That's in marriage. And so in my relationship with my wife, that's what our roles are to be. And my wife is to submit to me. She doesn't have to submit to him. Or him over there. You can't see him or him over there. The Bible talks about submission to me. And so it's in that relationship alone. And that has to do in both instances, whether you're talking about marriage or whether you're talking about in the church, that has to do with the creation and the fall. And it doesn't have to do with anything else. It's a statement of the fact that God created in a certain order, the man first and then the woman, and that there was a fall, and that the woman was in the transgression, Paul says in that passage, at the fall. And so that's why the order is set up that way. And you have it again with marriage. God makes it clear that the woman was going to be submissive to the man in Genesis chapter 3. And it's a function of the fall. And so that's all it is. It has nothing to do with anything else. It has nothing to do with emotionalism. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It has nothing to do with strengths. It has nothing to do with those things. And it's just the creation and the fall.
So the two specific things that you just listed are the only places you can say 1 Timothy chapter 2, and it's not even, it really, when you dive into this stuff as far as submission, I'm supposed to be submitting to my wife, she's supposed to be submitting to me. It's in the context of order, of a final decision making, and how God set it up as a picture.
Right, yeah. And if you're doing it right, you're not going to have a tyranny, and you're not going to have passive aggressive nonsense.
Yeah.
If you're doing it right.
Right.
And if you have a tyranny or passive aggressive nonsense, then you're doing it wrong. You don't get passive aggressive with Jesus, and Jesus is not a tyrant. So it's that simple. And that's the way it is in all relationships. So obviously women can be bosses and that kind of thing. So
right.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a
Lydia was a seller of purple. She had her own business.
We might spend the rest of the show on this one. We'll see.
Okay.
They say, "Hi, I'm a Christian, saved by my Savior in Christ, and believe with all my heart," and says some personal things. But she says in Revelation 22:15 that it talks about prescription drugs and the Greek word for sorcery or witchcraft. She says, "I'm having a struggle with my daughter talking about whether anyone should take drugs prescribed by your doctor if the drug alters your mind. Example is for PTSD, which I have from a near-fatal car wreck, which left me on disability. I also take insulin and meds for BP and arthritis. She says that I am succumbing to Satan. Could you answer that question for me? Thank you."
Okay, first off, there's an assumption there that we're talking about prescription drugs. And,
right.
Verse 15 there. It's a word for sorcerers, and it's the Greek word pharmakia, and it is where we get our word pharmaceutical. But sorcerers were not using drugs for medicine. They were using drugs to go on a trip and never leave the farm. They were using drugs illicitly, and so what you're describing is not pharmakia. Now, if you were going out and taking heroin or meth or something like that, you are violating the passage, and you are doing exactly what the passage is talking about with illicit drug use. And so medicines are things that are talked about in the Bible. And so in Jeremiah it talks about, is there no balm in Gilead? In Proverbs chapter 17, verse 22, I believe it is, it says that laughter or a merry heart does good like a medicine. When you get to the New Testament, what's a good example? Jesus, in talking about the Good Samaritan, talks about the fact that there's this guy who's been beat up, and when he's beat up, he takes and pours wine and oil on the wounds, and what he's using is alcohol to get rid of the germs, and so it's an antiseptic, and that's a medicine. And then an oil was something that was used to promote healing, and then he wrapped him up with bandages and stuff like that. So even Jesus is talking about medicine, and again, it's in a parable, but he's not against medicine. As a matter of fact, if you, in the same passage here, let me look here, in chapter 22, it says in verse 2. Let's start in verse 1. It says, "And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street and on either side of the river was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." That's medicine. That's where, back in the times that we're speaking about, these guys were doing what we would call herbal medicines. And that's exactly what's being spoken about in that passage. That is in the new heaven and the new earth, in the millennium, in Ezekiel chapter 47, and I got a reference here, verse 12, you have exactly the same thing on the earth. And again, the leaves of the trees that are on the river that's coming out of Jerusalem on the earth there, again, are used for healing. And so you have medicine that's being used during the kingdom age. And so that's something where God is involved in that whole thing. And so, the Bible is not against medicine. Luke was a doctor. He was a physician. And he hung out with Paul the Apostle. And the reason that Paul needed a friend like Luke is because the guy got beat so many times, and so he had a doctor with him. He had issues. And so the Bible never teaches that medicine is something that's evil or wicked or of Satan. And so probably what's happened is your daughter's gotten involved in a group that is teaching the health and wealth gospel. And it's the idea that we don't need medicines anymore because when Jesus died on the cross, by his stripes we are healed. And so therefore you don't need anything else. And that is just not something that the Bible teaches. You have situations. Paul, for example, left Epaphroditus in a certain city sick, and he had been praying for him, and God healed him in the end. But Paul says that he was sick because of doing the will of God, and that's in Philippians, I believe it is. Yeah, it's in Philippians. And so when you look at what the Bible has to say about medicines, everything that you're talking about, you do not stop taking your insulin. Obviously, you're a diabetic. You know what will happen if you stop taking your insulin. And so whenever I've talked to somebody who had that kind of mindset, where they were saying you need to stop taking your medicine as an act of faith and that kind of stuff, that is never how healing took place in the Bible. You didn't have a situation where Jesus healed somebody and he left them in their exact same state and walked away and just said basically believe it, and I don't know, and someday you'll be healed or whatever. It wasn't like that. When Jesus healed people, he really healed them, and there were times when he had them do something. One time he came up with a blind guy, and then he spit on the ground and took the mud and stuck it in the guy's eye and told him the obvious: go down and wash your eyes out. And the guy washed his eyes out and he was healed. But the guy didn't go on for days and days, thinking that, trying to believe that he was healed. Jesus just healed the guy. So when you're healed, you're healed. And so I'm not a guy who thinks that God can't heal you from anything, including diabetes. He can heal you of diabetes, but there's going to be a way that you find out about that. If he's healed you of diabetes, you know what happens if you have too much insulin, right? And so you'll be able to tell your blood sugar will be different if you've been healed of diabetes. And then you stop taking your medicine at that point. But don't do it before the fact. When you're talking about some of these other drugs, for example, for PTSD, and you're talking about mind-altering drugs, and I'm not a big medicine guy. I don't take a lot of medicine, and so a lot of times when I'm talking about this stuff, I just rather hack it through the pain a lot of times, with some of the stuff that I deal with. But I'm not dealing with anything like what you are, and so that's where I'm at in my experience. But with some of these things, they are mind altering, and you don't want to be on them for the rest of your life. And so if you're dealing with PTSD and that kind of thing, you might want to talk to a counselor, and there are issues that can be taken care of as far as handling the trauma that comes with situations like what you're describing, and you don't have to be on medicines for the rest of your life. And so, if I was taking a med, and I was in that kind of situation, I would be looking forward to getting off it, because I don't want to live on meds for the rest of my life. And they, obviously there's side effects, and they can do stuff to your liver and that kind of thing. And so, I'm not even a guy who looks at meds and goes, you need to be on these things for the rest of your life, except in cases where there are actual physical problems, like with your pancreas and diabetes. So, but even with that, I don't know what kind of meds you're taking for the PTSD. But most likely you're taking some kind of antidepressant, and you do not stop taking those. You don't just stop taking them because they alter your brain chemistry, and you're going to have real problems because your brain chemistry has been altered. This is why a lot of people, when they stop taking some of the meds that they're antidepressants specifically, they get suicidal at that point because they've just dropped the meds. There's a way to come off those, and the doctor will help you to do that, and you can do it slowly over time. Blood pressure, that kind of thing. It's like if I'd rather take a pill than have my heart blow up. If there's other things that you can do, with weight and diet and that kind of stuff, that can help with that. That's just a health choice on those things. But the Bible does not teach that medicine is bad for you. In fact, Paul the Apostle, when he was talking to Timothy, this is a famous passage. This is in 1 Timothy chapter 5. And he says, when you drink water, don't just drink water anymore. Take a little wine with the water for your stomach's sake. And what Paul was saying to Timothy is the water's bad. You're getting sick, from the water. And they didn't know all about germs at the time, but they did know that if you added wine to water, it made it something that wouldn't make you sick anymore. And so what Paul was doing was telling them to use wine as a medicine in that situation. And so again, you have this all over Scripture. And so the only time that these passages on sorcery are applicable to somebody is when you're dealing with illicit drug use, where you're having visions and, we call them trips and hallucinations and that kind of stuff. But that's what sorcerers would do. They would take drugs to have hallucinations. And if you're doing that, then yeah, you're wrong. But if you're doing it for other reasons, then no, you're not.
So let me ask you this. You talked to Mary's specific case and what she's dealing with and not to go off those meds and went through the whole thing of blood pressure and all that stuff. Setting that aside, not talking about Mary, but just the area of meds that potentially, that do alter your mind for anxiety and stuff. And just from my background, are there any of those meds or cases, and is it based off of the person's heart or their will that go into the area of pharmakia? And what I mean by that is this. In our culture, and this is what I saw, working in corrections, someone comes in, hey, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, I'm not happy, and the answer that society has, because they don't have any spiritual means, is take this pill. And so they take this pill, but it doesn't solve the spiritual problems in their life. Right, yeah. So is there any point where taking those pills that alter your mind cross over to pharmakia, where it's this drug abuse issue, or is it totally separate?
Well, obviously you can have phases that people go through, and so if you got guys who are using pharmaceutical drugs to get high off of, and so oxycodone and that kind of stuff. That's a real famous thing, and in our country, and so that is using a doctor prescribed pharmaceutical for pharmakia, right? And obviously you're getting high off those things. When you're talking about and another thing that you need to know about drugs is that they're all mind altering.
Sure.
So when you're talking about caffeine, it's mind altering. And so it's not that's not just the definition. And so there are. Right. There are levels of this kind of thing. And so when you're talking about your situation with the pharmakia thing, when it becomes a spiritual issue, when it really becomes an issue of there's obviously a spiritual element that's going along with this, and
meaning that it takes you like into the spiritual realm,
it brings you in bondage.
Bondage, okay.
Yeah, when you're in bondage to something, and we've got freedom in Christ. And so I don't want to be in bondage to anything.
Right.
And so when you're talking about something like insulin, you can call it bondage, but basically it's medicine that's keeping you alive, and until you go home to be with the Lord, and or until the Lord heals you physically here, and either way you're going to get healed. When you're talking about some of the other uses of antidepressants and that kind of stuff, it can become a bondage issue. It can, it can be something where I'm taking something that I don't necessarily need, and I've become dependent upon that thing, not because my body actually needs it, but because it makes me feel good, or
Right.
and there's a bondage element to that, and then it can cross over into a spiritual arena where Satan starts using the drug with you, and he can flip you out. And it's just wild to me that a lot of the hallucinations that people have, they're not rainbows and unicorns. They're
Never.
dark. Yeah,
Always.
it's always messed up, and Satan uses that
Every time I saw
to
someone
attack
tripped
somebody.
out on drugs, they were seeing demons and screaming out in Jesus' name
Right.
and all this weird spiritual angelic realm stuff.
Right.
Every single time.
Yeah.
It was never Allah. It was never Joseph Smith. Ever.
Yeah.
To the man. It was always screaming Jesus and demons and hell and Satan.
Right. Yeah. And that's why you're asking the question, because you've got experience with that. It's like you can see what's happening with people many times when they're taking that. So yeah, any time that there's an abuse of pharmaceutical, then it can move into that arena. And so, again, we need to be careful about these things, and be dependent upon the Holy Spirit. And if I've got an emotional issue that I'm trying to take care of, there are times when medicine is totally valid for that, but it doesn't need to be the rest of my life. Let me give you another verse.
Okay.
This is out of Proverbs, chapter 31, and it says this is verse 4 of Proverbs 31. It says, "It's not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to those who are bitter of heart. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his misery no more." And so there are behavior appropriate situations to escape emotional issues. And so somebody has a real hard time at some point in their life, and what the author is saying here, it's King Lemuel's mother. It may be Bathsheba in the passage, and what she's saying is there are times when people are going through things that are so overwhelming that they just need to forget what's going on. They need to be, I don't know, they need to be tranquilized. That's what they used to call it, using tranquilizers, and to be able to get sleep and that kind of thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, but living that way for the rest of your life is not what God's called you to. So there's going to be a period of time of pain, a period of time of grief, and once the pain and the grief, once you can get past those things, you should get past them and be able to move on. And in this instance, what they're using is alcohol, wine specifically, as a soporific, or as like a tranquilizer in the situation. But the norm is no, you don't do that, because it'll alter your view of things.
Can you, this is just my brain going squirrel rabbit trails, but can you do that and not be drunk? Can you use that as a tranquilizer and not get blasted? And biblically use that verse, but not violate New Testament passages on
Well, I
drunk?
think so. I mean, it depends on the, it's like when we talk about drunkenness, we're talking about a situation where, our blood alcohol level reaches a certain point and we can't drive heavy equipment like cars.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. And so that's what we're looking at in a situation like that. And we've determined that there's a certain point where your reaction time and all that kind of stuff is going to be so inhibited that you'll be a danger to somebody. And so that's why we have the drug alcohol level type thing. I used to drink, and I could drink and not get drunk, and it would feel pleasant at the time, and that kind of thing. And so yeah, I think there is. But again, it's in that situation. It's not in normal life.
Right.
So I've known some people who have gotten on antidepressants, and they had good reason to be on antidepressants. There were awful things that were happening to them, and they couldn't function. And so that's what the verse is talking about. But again, I don't want to live there for 8 years. I want to live there for a period of time, and once I get past the grief, or once I get past the painful situations I'm going through, then I need to be able to move on and trust in the Holy Spirit and have the walk with God that He's called me to. So it's not that the Bible doesn't allow that. It's just that we're not to be dependent upon those things.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Good.
I think so.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Hopefully you guys have been blessed today. Appreciate you watching the show. Hopefully you were ministered to with God's Word. If you have questions for us, you guys can email me at crosswalkradio@gmail.com. You guys can text me or voicemail 707-872-7677. If you're looking for a church, we have a Sunday morning service at 7:30 indoors, 9:15 and 11 o'clock in our outdoor amphitheater service. Sometimes that is weather dependent, swaps around, so check our website if those issues are going on. We also have a 6:30 Wednesday night service, which is tonight. We'd love to have you if you want to come on out. Pastor Steve's in the Book of John, or a Sunday night service at 6:30. Of course, all our services are online as well. That's it. That's all I have. So see you guys next week on True Set Free, Wednesday at 3:30. God bless you.